Please, help. In the dead of night, the pounding on the door shattered the silence of a widow's home. On the porch, a biker trembling, his leather jacket torn. Across his back, the words Hell's Angels, a name enough to make the whole street bolt their doors. But the lonely black woman, hands shaking, chose to turn the key anyway. She had no idea that this small act would change the rest of her life. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Drop a comment below and tell me. Ruth had been alone for 7 years. 7 long years since Samuel died, and left her with nothing but memories and a mortgage that felt heavier every month. She had gotten used to the quiet. She had made peace with the silence that filled every room of the house they had shared for 46 years. But tonight the wind was loud enough to wake the dead, rattling her windows like an angry fist demanding entry. The house groaned under the pressure. Tree branches scraped against the siding with sounds like fingernails on a chalkboard. Ruth pulled her robe tighter and tried to focus on her crossword puzzle, but the words kept blurring together. At her age, storms like this were more than just weather. They were reminders of how fragile everything really was. Then came the pounding. 3 hard knocks on her front door, like someone was trying to break it down with their bare hands. Ruth's hand froze halfway to her mouth, teacup trembling in her grip. Her heart started hammering in her chest like a trapped bird. See, 3 months ago, someone had broken into her house while she was at the grocery store. They had taken Samuel's gold watch, the good silverware her mother had given her, and every ounce of safety she had felt in her own home. The police said it happened all the time to older folks living alone. Easy targets, they called it. Vulnerable populations. She had started keeping a baseball bat by the front door after that. Louisville Slugger, the kind Samuel used to coach Little League with back when Nathan was still young enough to think his father hung the moon. The knocking came again, harder this time, more desperate. Then a voice cut through the storm, rough as sandpaper, desperate as a drowning man. Help, that was it. One word, but something in the way he said it made Ruth inch toward the window despite every instinct screaming at her to stay away. She pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside, her breath fogging the glass. What she saw should have sent her running for the phone to call 911. A man hunched against her porch post like he was trying to become part of the wood. Snow caked on his shoulders thick as frosting on a wedding cake. Blood dripping from his left arm onto her welcome mat, each drop spreading dark against the white snow. And across the back of his leather jacket, clear as day even in the storm, were the words that made normal people cross the street and lock their car doors. Hell's Angels. The patch curved across his broad shoulders like a billboard advertising danger. Below it, in smaller letters that somehow seemed more ominous, Prospect. Ruth had seen the headlines just last week. Biker brawl leaves 2 hospitalized in Casper. The article talked about drugs and violence, about organized crime masquerading as motorcycle enthusiasm. But she had also seen the other story on the same page, the one most people probably skipped over. Motorcycle charity ride raises $63,000 for Children's Hospital. 2 truths, side by side, like opposite faces of the same coin. But which version was bleeding on her porch tonight? Through the gap in the curtain she watched him drag his fallen motorcycle under the eaves of her porch with one good arm, the other hanging useless at his side. Even injured, even desperate, he was still trying to protect his bike from the storm. Someone careless does not do that. Someone who means harm does not move that carefully, that respectfully of other people's property. Please, the voice was weaker now, fading like a radio signal in a storm. I cannot make it much further. Ruth's hand hovered over the deadbolt, trembling with more than just the cold seeping through the window. Every instinct Samuel had drilled into her over 46 years of marriage screamed against opening that door. Strange men, dark nights, recent break-ins, all the warnings that came with being a woman alone in the world. But then she remembered something else Samuel used to say, back when he was coaching Little League and teaching Sunday school and believing the world was full of people worth saving. The measure of a person is not what they do when it's easy, Ruth, it's what they do when it costs them something. The deadbolt clicked like a gunshot in the quiet house. Cold air rushed in as the man stumbled forward, nearly collapsing against her doorframe like he had been holding himself upright through sheer willpower alone. Up close he was younger than she had expected. Maybe 35, maybe 40. Hard to tell with the weather and the blood and the exhaustion written across his face like a roadmap of hard living. Tattoos snaked up his neck in intricate patterns she could not quite make out in the dim porch light. They were not the skulls and flames she had expected though. They looked like flags, military symbols. Dog tags caught the light against his chest, glinting like silver promises against the black leather. He lifted his head with obvious effort, and Ruth saw his eyes for the first time. Gray as the storm clouds overhead. Exhausted as a man who had been running for days, and something else she had not expected to see in the face of a man wearing those patches. Shame. Name's Vincent, he said. 2 words delivered like they cost him something precious. He swayed on his feet, and Ruth found herself reaching out to steady him before she could think twice about it. His body radiated pain, not threat. Up close, he smelled like motor oil and leather and the metallic tang of blood, but also something else. Something that reminded her of Samuel after a long day working in the garage. Honest sweat, and honest work. I'm Ruth Harper, you're hurt. Vincent nodded once, the motion careful and controlled. Bike went down 2 miles back. Wind caught me wrong. Shoulders out of the socket. Wrist might be broken. Ruth looked at this man who could probably bench press her car, standing in her doorway like a lost child, asking permission to come in from the cold. Blood was seeping through his jacket, and his left arm hung at an angle that made her wince in sympathy. She had worked as a librarian for 40 years before retiring. You learn to read people when you spend that much time helping folks find what they are looking for, whether it is information about genealogy or a quiet place to sit when home gets too loud or too empty. This man was not dangerous. He was broken. Sit by the stove, she said, stepping back to let him pass. Vincent moved like he was afraid of breaking something valuable. He slipped off his boots by the door without being asked, even though the effort clearly cost him. He tried not to drip water on her floor, angling his body to keep the melting snow from spreading. When Ruth came back from the linen closet with towels and her first aid kit, he was sitting in Samuel's old chair, staring at his hands like he was trying to figure out how they had gotten so far from where they belonged. She had learned to read pain in all its forms during Samuel's final illness. Physical pain had a particular quality to it, a way of sitting in someone's shoulders and tightening around their eyes. This man had that look, but also something deeper, something that spoke of hurts that went beyond broken bones and torn skin. You were in the military, she said, cleaning the gash on his forearm with the gentle efficiency of someone who had bandaged plenty of scraped knees and cut fingers over the years. Marines, Vincent said. His voice was gravelly, like he had not used it much lately. Long time ago. How long? 15 years, maybe 16. Hard to keep track sometimes. Ruth pressed a clean towel against the wound, noting how he did not even flinch when the antiseptic bit into the torn flesh. She had seen that before too, during Samuel's treatments. Sometimes when you have been hurt enough, your body stops registering new pain as anything worth mentioning. What do you do now? Work at Morrison's garage downtown. Fix bikes mostly. Some cars when they need the work. That explained the motor oil under his fingernails, the way his hands moved with automatic precision even when the rest of him was shaking with exhaustion. Good hands, Samuel would have called them. Working hands that knew how to make broken things whole again. You hungry? Ruth asked when she finished tying off the bandage. For the first time since he had knocked on her door, something shifted in Vincent's face, not quite a smile, but the shadow of what a smile might look like if it ever decided to visit. Yes, ma'am. If it's not too much trouble. Ruth heated up leftover chicken soup, the kind she made every Sunday out of habit, even though there was usually too much for one person. Vincent ate slowly, carefully, like he was afraid of making noise or taking up too much space at her table. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the spoon, whether from exhaustion or blood loss or something else entirely. When he finished, he set the spoon down with the kind of care you would use handling your grandmother's china. Everything about his movements spoke of someone who had learned not to break things, not to take more than was offered, not to assume he was welcome anywhere. Soup's good, he said. Thank you. Ruth glanced out the kitchen window while she cleared his bowl. Mrs. Caldwell was on her porch across the street, despite the late hour, phone pressed to her ear like she was reporting breaking news. Her eyes were locked on Ruth's kitchen window like a hawk watching a mouse, taking in every detail for later dissection and judgment. Ruth did not need to hear the conversation to know what Mrs. Caldwell was saying. The fear and suspicion were written plain as day across her neighbor's face, illuminated by the porch light that cast harsh shadows across features pinched with disapproval. Inside, Vincent was looking around her kitchen like he was memorizing it, not casing it for valuables, but appreciating it, taking in the worn wooden table where she ate her solitary meals, the photographs of Samuel on the refrigerator, the small touches that made a house feel like a home. "Storm eases up, I'll be gone," he said, his voice quiet and matter-of-fact. "Do not want to bring you any more trouble than I already have." Ruth studied his face, noting the way weariness sat in the lines around his eyes, the careful way he held himself like someone who had learned to expect rejection and was already preparing for it. "Floor's fine for sleeping," he added when she did not immediately respond. "Used to worse." "Do not be foolish," Ruth said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "Couch is better for someone with a separated shoulder." Vincent nodded once and settled where she pointed, moving with the cautious gratitude of someone who had not expected kindness and was not entirely sure what to do with it now that he had found it. Ruth gathered an extra blanket from the hall closet and a pillow that still smelled faintly of Samuel's aftershave. As she arranged them on the couch, she found herself studying this stranger who had appeared out of the storm like something from a fairy tale. The leather jacket with its ominous patches hung over the back of a chair, transformed by context from a symbol of menace into just another piece of clothing drying by her fire. That night, Ruth lay awake in her bedroom, listening to the storm weaken outside and the sound of steady breathing from downstairs. A stranger in her house, a Hell's Angel. And yet she felt safer than she had in months, like having another person under her roof had somehow made the walls stronger and the locks more secure. Sleep came eventually, bringing dreams of Samuel and storms and doors that opened onto possibilities she had never dared imagine. She woke to voices outside her bedroom window, sharp voices that cut through the morning air like knives through silk. Ruth checked her bedside clock. 7:15 in the morning. Too early for casual neighborhood conversation, too loud and urgent for anything good. She pulled on her robe and moved to the window, easing the curtain aside just enough to see what was happening. Mrs. Caldwell stood in her front yard like a general marshalling troops, phone in one hand and pointing at Ruth's house with the other. Three neighbors huddled around her like conspirators planning a coup, their faces flushed with the excitement of shared outrage and moral certainty. "I am telling you, Helen," Caldwell was saying, her voice carrying across the frost-covered yards with the clarity of someone who wanted to be overheard. "She has lost her mind completely, harboring criminals all night long. That motorcycle has gang colors all over it. This is how they work, you know. They find vulnerable old folks and move right in. Next thing you know, the whole neighborhood will be overrun with drugs and violence." Ruth's stomach dropped like a stone thrown into deep water. She had expected whispers, maybe some disapproving looks across the street. She had not expected a full tribunal forming on her front lawn before breakfast, complete with character witnesses and a prosecution case. Downstairs, she could hear Vincent moving around, the careful sounds of someone trying not to make noise. When she reached the kitchen, she found him folding blankets with his good arm, stacking them neatly with the pillow balanced on top. Even injured and exhausted, he was trying to erase any evidence of his presence, to minimize the inconvenience he imagined he had caused. "They are talking about me," he said, without looking up from his task. "They are talking about both of us," Ruth replied, cinching her robe tighter around her waist. "Mrs. Caldwell has never been particularly fond of me. This gives her something concrete to disapprove of." Vincent moved to the kitchen window and parted the curtain carefully, just enough to see outside. More neighbors were gathering now, drawn by the promise of drama and the magnetic pull of other people's business. His jaw tightened as he took in the scene. "Somebody called the police," he said, his voice flat and unsurprised. "Patrol car coming down the street." Sure enough, a black and white cruiser was rolling slowly down Maple Street, its tires crunching through the frozen ruts left by last night's storm. Officer Martinez stepped out, a young man Ruth recognized from the library. He had brought his children there for story time when they were smaller, back when Ruth still worked behind the circulation desk and knew every family in the county by their reading habits. "I should go," Vincent said, moving toward where his jacket hung drying by the radiator. "Last thing you need is more trouble because of me." "No." Ruth's voice surprised even her with its firmness. "You are hurt. You stay put until you are well enough to ride safely." Vincent looked at her like she had just offered to jump off a bridge with him, his gray eyes wide with something that might have been gratitude or might have been disbelief. Officer Martinez's knock came measured and polite, the kind of official courtesy that managed to be respectful and authoritative at the same time. "Mrs. Harper, police, just need to have a word with you if you do not mind." Ruth opened the door, noting how Martinez held his hat in his hand and kept his voice calm and professional despite the small crowd of neighbors watching from across the street, like spectators at a particularly interesting sporting event. "Morning, Mrs. Harper," Martinez said, tipping his head in greeting. "Got a call about a possible disturbance here last night. Everything all right?" "Everything is fine, Officer Martinez. A man was hurt in the storm last night and I helped him. That is all." Martinez glanced past her shoulder, taking in the scene behind her with the practiced assessment of someone trained to read situations quickly. The leather jacket draped over a chair, its patches visible but not threatening in the domestic context of Ruth's kitchen. Vincent standing in the doorway to the living room, his injured arm in a makeshift sling, looking less like a dangerous criminal and more like someone who had been through a very bad night. "Vincent Kozlowski," Martinez asked, his tone shifting slightly. "Yes sir." "You still working over at Morrison's garage?" "Yes sir." Something shifted in Martinez's expression at the confirmation. Recognition perhaps, or the recalibration that comes when someone you have mentally categorized one way turns out to fit a different category entirely. Not a dangerous stranger invading the neighborhood, but a local mechanic who had gotten caught in bad weather. "You hurt bad?" Martinez asked, his voice taking on a more personal tone. Vincent shrugged with his good shoulder, the gesture saying more than words about his tolerance for pain and his reluctance to complain about circumstances beyond his control. That was when Mrs. Caldwell decided to make her dramatic entrance. She marched across the yard like she was leading a crusade, her face flushed with righteous indignation and the unshakable certainty that comes with being absolutely convinced of your own moral superiority. "Officer Martinez," she announced in a voice loud enough to carry to the next county, "this woman has sheltered a gang member all night long. You know what these people are capable of. You know the violence they bring wherever they go. Do something before someone gets hurt." Martinez looked between the three of them with the patient expression of someone who had dealt with neighborhood disputes before and understood the difference between genuine emergencies and social drama. The injured mechanic, the elderly librarian, and the pack of neighbors waiting eagerly for whatever entertainment this confrontation might provide. "What I see," Martinez said slowly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who would not be rushed into hasty judgments, "is a storm, a motorcycle accident, and a neighbor helping someone in need. Unless somebody witnessed an actual crime being committed, there is nothing here that requires police intervention." Mrs. Caldwell's face went red as a fire engine, her mouth working like a fish gasping for air. "But he is a Hell's Angel. Everyone knows what that means." Vincent did not defend himself, did not argue or protest or try to explain the difference between reputation and reality. He just stood there with his hands visible and his mouth shut, letting the adults sort out whatever they needed to sort out while he waited for whatever judgment they would render. Ruth stepped forward before she could think twice about the consequences. "He will leave when he is able to travel safely. Not before." Martinez nodded once and touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and final. "You folks take care now. Mrs. Harper, you need anything, you know how to reach us." After Martinez left and his patrol car disappeared around the corner, the neighbors began to drift away like disappointed spectators leaving a sporting event that had failed to deliver the excitement they had been promised. Miss Caldwell lingered on the sidewalk, shooting Ruth a look that could have curdled fresh milk before retreating to her own porch to sulk and plan whatever revenge she might devise for this public embarrassment. Inside her house, Ruth leaned against the front door and felt her hands begin to shake with delayed reaction. The weight of their stares had been heavier than she had expected, the judgment more personal and cutting than she had prepared herself for. Vincent stood a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Told you," he said quietly. "The patch brings heat wherever it goes. You do not need this kind of trouble in your life." Ruth studied him for a long moment, taking in the way he held himself like someone expecting to be told to leave, the careful distance he maintained as if he was afraid of imposing further on her hospitality. "Let them talk," she said finally, surprising herself with the steel she heard in her own voice. Vincent looked up, and for the first time since he had collapsed against her doorframe in the storm, there was something beyond exhaustion in his expression. A flicker of respect maybe, or the beginning of hope that not everyone in the world had already made up their minds about who he was supposed to be. The real storm, Ruth realized, was only just beginning. 3 to 4 weeks after Vincent's accident, Ruth's life had settled into a new rhythm that felt both strange and comforting. The immediate drama of police visits and neighborhood gossip had died down to a manageable simmer, but the underlying tension remained like a low-grade fever that would not quite break. Vincent had become a regular fixture in her life, stopping by twice a week after his shift at Morrison's garage to check on her and tackle whatever small repairs her house needed. He never asked permission, never made a big show of his help. He would simply appear at her back door with a toolbox and get to work on whatever problem had been bothering her since his last visit. Ruth found herself looking forward to these visits more than she cared to admit, even to herself. For 7 years her days had been measured in the small routines of solitary living, morning coffee, afternoon crossword puzzles, evening television programs that helped fill the silence without requiring too much attention. Vincent's presence disrupted those patterns in ways that felt like waking up after a long sleep. He worked with the methodical precision of someone who understood that broken things could be made whole again with enough patience and the right tools. Ruth would make coffee and watch him repair loose boards on her back steps or tune up the ancient lawnmower that had been sputtering since the Carter administration. They did not talk much during these sessions. Vincent was not built for small talk or casual conversation, but Ruth had learned to read the language he did speak fluently. The way he tested every screw twice before considering a job complete. How he cleaned up after himself like he was afraid of leaving any evidence of his presence behind. The careful distance he maintained, always asking permission before entering her house, never assuming he was welcome to stay longer than his work required. It was during one of these quiet Tuesday afternoon visits that the letter arrived. Ruth signed for the certified mail with steady hands, though something cold and heavy settled in her stomach when she recognized the law firm's letterhead embossed across the expensive paper. She waited until Vincent finished adjusting the wobbly leg on her kitchen table before opening the envelope, somehow knowing that whatever was inside would change everything between them. Petition for emergency guardianship, the first page read in bold official letters that seemed to leap off the paper. Below that, in smaller but equally ominous print, Nathan Bennett vs. Ruth Harper, regarding the mental competency and care of the respondent. Ruth sank into her kitchen chair and read the document with growing horror, each paragraph hitting her like a physical blow. Her son Nathan was seeking legal guardianship over her, claiming she was no longer mentally competent to manage her own affairs. The petition painted a picture of an elderly woman whose judgment had become dangerously impaired, who was vulnerable to manipulation by criminal elements and needed the protection of a court-appointed guardian. The evidence cited came largely from neighborhood testimony that Lisa, Nathan's wife, had apparently been collecting like ammunition for weeks. Increasingly erratic behavior, poor judgment regarding personal safety, association with known gang members and criminal elements. Each accusation felt like a betrayal, not just from Nathan and Lisa, but from neighbors she had lived beside for 15 years. At the bottom of the petition, Nathan had signed his name with the kind of flourish that suggested he was proud of what he was doing. Below his signature was another name that made Ruth's heart break completely: Lisa Bennett, witness and co-petitioner. Her own son and daughter-in-law were trying to have her declared mentally incompetent, all because she had opened her door to help a stranger during a storm. Vincent found her 20 minutes later, still sitting at the table with the legal documents spread before her like evidence of her own trial. He read over her shoulder without asking permission, his jaw tightening with each page. "This is about me," he said when he finished, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. Ruth nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. Vincent pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found the number he wanted. "I am calling Thomas." Within an hour, Ruth's kitchen was filled with men who looked like they could tear down buildings with their bare hands but spoke with the careful precision of people who had learned to think before they acted. Thomas Morrison, the chapter president, had the kind of presence that made other people automatically defer to his judgment. Jake Morrison, Thomas's son, carried himself with the alert stillness of someone who had spent years reading situations and people for a living. Eddie Santos, the youngest of the group, kept cracking his knuckles like he wanted to hit something but was waiting for permission to decide what. They read Nathan's petition in silence, passing pages back and forth with the kind of careful attention Ruth remembered from library board meetings when budgets were tight and every decision mattered. "This is serious," Jake said finally, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with legal systems before and understood how quickly they could destroy lives. "Guardianship cases can move very fast, especially when they involve allegations of mental incompetence. If Nathan can convince a judge that you are not thinking clearly, they can grant him temporary guardianship while they conduct a full investigation. Once that happens, you lose control over your own money, your own house, your own medical decisions, everything." Ruth felt the walls of her world closing in around her like the walls of a cell. The thought of losing control over her own life, of being warehoused in some institutional care facility while Nathan and Lisa sold her house and spent her savings on their own problems, was more terrifying than anything she had faced since Samuel's death. "What can I do?" she asked, hating how small and helpless her own voice sounded. Vincent reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the gesture so natural and protective that Ruth felt tears sting her eyes. "First thing we do is get you a lawyer, a good one who specializes in elder law and knows how to fight this kind of legal manipulation." Thomas nodded grimly, already reaching for his phone. "I am calling my daughter-in-law Sarah. She handles cases like this all the time, knows every trick these predators try to pull. She is tough as nails and does not back down from family drama." Jake was already typing on his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "I still have contacts from my years as a licensed investigator. If they want to paint you as mentally incompetent, we will pull court records, financial filings, employment history, anything public that shows what kind of people are making these accusations against you." Ruth watched these men mobilize on her behalf with a mixture of gratitude and amazement that left her speechless. 24 hours ago, they had been casual acquaintances, people she made coffee for during Vincent's repair visits. Now they were treating her crisis as if it were their own family emergency, bringing resources and expertise she never could have accessed on her own. "Jake," Thomas said, ending his phone call and turning to his son, "what can you find out about Nathan's current situation? If he is trying to get control over Ruth's finances, there has to be a reason he needs money fast." Jake's expression grew progressively grimmer as he pulled up information on his computer screen, his search revealing layers of financial desperation that explained everything about Nathan's sudden concern for his mother's welfare. Nathan Bennett, age 42, currently unemployed, has been out of work for 6 months since he was fired from his sales job for missing too many days, has been arrested twice in the past year for public intoxication and once for disturbing the peace outside a casino in Cheyenne, has outstanding gambling debts with at least 3 different bookmakers totaling approximately $53,000. Ruth's stomach dropped as the full scope of her son's problems became clear. She had known Nathan was drinking too much, that his marriage to Lisa was troubled and his work situation was unstable, but she had not realized how completely his life had spiraled out of control or how desperate he had become. "There is more," Jake continued, his voice taking on the clinical tone of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. "Lisa Bennett was fired from her job at Consolidated Insurance 3 weeks ago for suspected embezzlement. They have not filed charges yet, but the investigation is ongoing and the evidence looks pretty damning. Their apartment is 4 months behind on rent, and they have bounced checks at 7 different local businesses in the past 2 months. The picture that emerged was devastating and clear. Nathan and Lisa were not concerned family members trying to protect a vulnerable elderly woman. They were desperate people drowning in debt and bad decisions, and they saw Ruth's house and savings as a life preserver that could save them from the consequences of their own choices. "They need money," Vincent said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence that had settled over the kitchen. "And your assets represent a way out of their problems." Thomas's phone rang, interrupting the grim recitation of Nathan's failures. He answered quickly, speaking in low, urgent tones with someone Ruth assumed was the lawyer daughter-in-law. After several minutes of conversation punctuated by technical legal terms Ruth did not understand, he hung up and turned to face her with an expression that mixed determination with concern. "Sarah can take the case," he announced, "but she needs to know how serious you are about fighting this. Guardianship battles can get very ugly, especially when they involve family members. Nathan and his lawyer will attack your character, your judgment, your mental capacity, everything about you they can twist to serve their purposes. They will use every friendship you have ever made, every decision you have ever taken, every moment of ordinary human behavior as evidence that you are not competent to manage your own affairs." Ruth thought about what Thomas was telling her, weighing the cost of fighting against the cost of surrender. She could battle Nathan in court, expose his financial problems and gambling addiction, drag the whole ugly situation through the legal system while lawyers got rich and neighbors chose sides. Or she could accept defeat, let Nathan have what he wanted, and hope he would at least put her somewhere comfortable while he liquidated her life's work to pay off his debts. The easy path would be capitulation. The safe path would be compromise. The dignified path might be to quietly disappear into whatever facility Nathan selected, and let him get on with spending her money. Ruth looked around her kitchen at the faces of people who had become more of a family to her in 2 weeks than her blood relatives had ever been. Part of her wanted to collapse, to let Nathan win and be done with the fight before it really started. But another part of her, the part Samuel had always admired and encouraged, refused to yield without a battle. "I want to fight," she whispered at first, then repeated it louder, her voice steadying with each word. Nathan made his choices. He chose gambling over responsibility, drinking over family, greed over love. I will not be punished for his failures. Vincent smiled, the first genuine expression of joy she had seen from him since the petition arrived. "That is the spirit we needed to hear." Jake closed his laptop with the satisfied air of someone who had found exactly the ammunition he was looking for. "Fighting back means we investigate Nathan and Lisa as thoroughly as they are investigating you. We find every debt, every bad check, every questionable decision they have made over the past 5 years. We make it clear to the court that the people trying to control your life cannot manage their own." Ruth nodded, though part of her grieved for the son Nathan had once been, the little boy who had helped her plant tomatoes in the backyard and dreamed of becoming a firefighter when he grew up. "There is something else you need to understand," Thomas said carefully, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering unwelcome but necessary information. "If we are going to fight this properly, you need to be prepared for what you are up against. Nathan's lawyer will argue that your association with us proves you are not thinking clearly. They will say that no rational elderly woman would befriend motorcycle club members unless she was being manipulated or had lost her mental faculties." The irony was not lost on Ruth. The best thing that had happened to her in years, finding a community of people who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide them, was being used as evidence that she was mentally incompetent. "Let them argue," she said firmly. "I know who my real family is." The evaluation center felt like a cross between a hospital and a minimum security prison. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the kind of harsh white illumination that made everyone look sickly and diminished. Ruth sat in the waiting area on a plastic chair that seemed designed to be as uncomfortable as possible, watching other families deal with their own crises and wondering how her life had brought her to this place. This was the first and most crucial step in Nathan's legal strategy. Have his mother declared mentally incompetent by a court-appointed psychiatrist. If Dr. Angela Peterson decided that Ruth could not make rational decisions about her own life, the guardianship would become almost automatic, a foregone conclusion rubber-stamped by a judge who had never met her. "Mrs. Harper," Dr. Peterson appeared in the waiting area with a clipboard and the kind of professional smile that revealed nothing about what the person wearing it was actually thinking. She was younger than Ruth had expected, maybe 45, with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had learned to keep her opinions to herself. "I am Dr. Peterson. If you will come with me, we can begin your evaluation. The evaluation room was windowless and deliberately small, furnished with 2 chairs and a small table that held a box of tissues, a pitcher of water, and several thick folders that presumably contained reports about Ruth's case. Everything about the setup was calculated to make the subject feel vulnerable and exposed while giving the examiner every possible psychological advantage. I want you to know that this evaluation is standard procedure in guardianship cases, Dr. Peterson began, settling into her chair with the practiced ease of someone who conducted these assessments on a regular basis. I am here to assess your cognitive function and decision-making capacity. The process will take several hours, and I need you to answer my questions honestly and completely. Do you understand what we are doing here? Ruth nodded, drawing on decades of experience dealing with bureaucratic procedures from her library career. She understood that this was as much a performance as it was an assessment, that her words and behavior would be analyzed and interpreted through the lens of predetermined categories that had little to do with who she actually was as a person. Let us start with some basic orientation questions, Dr. Peterson said, pen poised over her notepad like a weapon waiting to be deployed. Can you tell me today's date? The questions began simply enough, the kind of basic competency tests Ruth had expected. What day was it? Where was she? Who was the current president? What were the names of her immediate family members? But they quickly became more invasive, more pointed, more clearly designed to elicit responses that could be used against her. Tell me about your relationship with the motorcycle gang members. They're not a gang, Ruth corrected gently. They're a motorcycle club that does extensive charity work. One of their members was injured during a storm, and I helped him. Dr. Peterson made notes. Lots of notes. Ruth couldn't see what she was writing, but the scratching of pen on paper seemed ominous in the quiet room. Do you understand that most people would consider it unusual for a woman your age to associate with Hell's Angels? Ruth chose her words carefully. I understand that people often make assumptions based on limited information, but I don't base my decisions on what other people might think is usual. More notes. Dr. Peterson's expression remained professionally neutral, but Ruth sensed disapproval underneath the clinical facade. Have these men ever asked you for money? No. Gifts, favors, access to your home. They brought me gifts to thank me for helping their friend. They've never asked for anything. But they do have access to your home now, don't they? They visit regularly. Ruth felt the trap closing around her. Every honest answer seemed to provide more ammunition for the case against her competency. Vincent stops by twice a week to check on me and help with small repairs. The others have visited a few times for coffee and conversation. And you don't see anything concerning about men with criminal histories having regular access to your home and personal information. I don't know anything about criminal histories, Ruth said firmly. I know that Vincent is a veteran and a mechanic who does charity work. I know that Thomas and his friends have been nothing but respectful and kind to me. Dr. Peterson leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a tone of gentle concern that somehow felt more threatening than open hostility. Mrs. Harper, I need you to understand that your son Nathan is worried about you. He loves you and wants to make sure you're safe. Sometimes when we're lonely or isolated, we can become vulnerable to people who might take advantage of our good nature. Ruth felt anger rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. Doctor, I've been making decisions for myself for 73 years. I'm quite capable of judging whether someone is trustworthy. But judgment can be affected by many things. Grief, loneliness, the natural changes that come with aging. It's nothing to be ashamed of. The session continued for 3 hours, covering everything from Ruth's daily routine to her financial management, to her relationship history. By the end, Ruth felt wrung out and frustrated, as if every aspect of her life had been dissected and found wanting. Mrs. Harper, Dr. Peterson said as she gathered her notes, the court has ordered a 72-hour observation period. You'll be staying here while we complete our evaluation. Ruth's blood ran cold. Staying here? I thought this was just an interview. It's standard procedure in cases involving questions of competency. Don't worry, you'll be comfortable, and the staff will take good care of you. The room they gave Ruth was barely larger than a prison cell. A narrow bed with sheets that smelled of industrial bleach, a single window that looked out onto a parking lot, a door that locked from the outside. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed and tried to comprehend what was happening to her. Less than a month ago, she'd been an independent woman living peacefully in her own home. Now she was effectively imprisoned while strangers decided whether she was competent to manage her own life. The first night was the longest of Ruth's life since Samuel's death. The institutional sounds, televisions blaring from other rooms, staff conversations in the hallways, the periodic rattle of medication carts, made sleep nearly impossible. But worse than the noise was the crushing realization that she was completely powerless, that her fate now rested in the hands of people who didn't know her and didn't seem particularly interested in understanding who she really was. On the second day, Ruth was subjected to more tests, cognitive assessments, psychological questionnaires, interviews with different staff members, who all asked variations of the same questions. Each interaction felt like another opportunity for her words to be twisted, her motivations misunderstood, her character called into question. It was during the afternoon of the second day that Lisa arrived for a visit. Ruth was sitting in the common room, trying to read a magazine while ignoring the daytime television that blared from the corner, when she saw her daughter-in-law approaching with a bouquet of flowers and an expression of practiced concern. "Ruth," Lisa said, settling into the chair across from her with theatrical care, "this is so hard for all of us. Nathan's beside himself with worry." Ruth studied Lisa's face, noting the expensive makeup that couldn't quite hide the stress lines around her eyes, the designer clothes that seemed too formal for a casual visit to an elderly relative. This was a performance, Ruth realized. Lisa was here for a specific purpose. "I know you're confused," Lisa continued, her voice pitched to carry to the nearby staff members who were obviously listening. "These people you've been associating with, they've gotten you all turned around. Made you forget what's really important." Ruth said nothing, just watched Lisa arrange the flowers in the cheap plastic vase provided by the facility staff. "But we can fix this," Lisa said, her voice taking on a note of false warmth. "Nathan and I have been talking to some very nice facilities. Places where you'd be safe and cared for, where you wouldn't have to worry about making difficult decisions or dealing with people who might take advantage of your good nature." Lisa opened her purse and pulled out a folder of documents. "I brought some papers for you to look at. Just preliminary stuff, nothing binding. But if you sign them, we can start making arrangements. Power of attorney, financial management, that sort of thing. Take the pressure off you." Ruth stared at the papers without touching them. The documents would give Nathan and Lisa control over her life, her money, her future. All she had to do was sign her name and this whole ordeal would be over. No more legal battles, no more competency evaluations, no more fighting a system designed to grind down anyone who challenged its authority. She picked up the pen Lisa offered, then set it down again. Samuel's voice echoed in her memory, words from their wedding day. "Promise me something, Ruth. No matter what happens, no matter how hard things get, don't let anyone else decide who you are or what you're worth. You're stronger than you know, and you're worth fighting for." "No," Ruth said quietly. Lisa's carefully constructed mask slipped slightly. "Ruth, be reasonable. You're not thinking clearly. These biker friends of yours have confused you, made you paranoid about your own family." "My thinking is perfectly clear," Ruth replied, her voice growing stronger. "Clear enough to recognize manipulation when I see it." Lisa's voice took on a sharper edge. "Fine, have it your way. But don't expect Nathan and me to clean up the mess when your criminal friends get bored playing with their new pet and decide to rob you blind." After Lisa left, Ruth sat alone in the common room feeling as low as she had since Samuel's funeral. The weight of institutional confinement pressed down on her like a physical thing, and for a moment she wondered if fighting was worth the cost. Maybe Lisa was right, maybe she was too old, too naive, too trusting to navigate the modern world safely. That evening, an aide brought her a letter, hand-delivered, no return address, but Ruth recognized Vincent's careful handwriting on the envelope. "Mrs. Ruth," the letter began, and despite everything, Ruth smiled at the formal address that had become Vincent's pet name for her. "I wanted to write to let you know that you're not forgotten. The whole Brotherhood is thinking about you, praying for you, waiting for the chance to welcome you home. I know this legal fight is hard. I know people are telling you that you made a mistake, that you should have left me on your doorstep to handle my injuries alone. But you didn't. You opened your door and your heart, and that makes you the strongest person I know. What you did for me that night wasn't just about helping a stranger, it was about seeing past fear to find faith, past prejudice to find truth. You showed me that there are still people in this world who choose courage over comfort, who risk their own safety to help others. Don't let them convince you that kindness is weakness. Don't let them make you ashamed of doing what was right. We're fighting for you on the outside, but the most important battle is the one happening in your heart right now. Remember who you are. Remember what you're worth. Remember that angels come in many forms. Sometimes they wear leather and ride motorcycles, but sometimes they're 73-year-old librarians who open their doors during storms. The system wants you to believe that you're helpless, that you need someone else to make decisions for you. But I've seen you handle a medical emergency with skill and grace. I've watched you stand up to neighborhood bullies and police questioning with dignity and strength. I know that you're fully capable of managing your own life. Sarah Morrison is working around the clock to prepare your defense. Jake has uncovered financial records that show exactly why Nathan and Lisa are really pursuing this guardianship. Thomas has organized character witnesses who can testify to your competence and independence. But more than that, we're all bearing witness to who you really are. Not the confused elderly woman that Nathan's lawyers want the court to see, but Ruth Harper, the woman who chose compassion over caution, who built a chosen family from strangers, who proved that real strength comes from opening your heart, rather than building walls around it. Stay strong, Mrs. Ruth, your real family is waiting for you. Vincent. Ruth read the letter 3 times, holding it against her chest like a talisman against despair. Someone remembered who she was underneath all the legal accusations and medical evaluations. Someone believed in her capacity to fight back against people who would steal her dignity along with her independence. On the 3rd day, Dr. Peterson called her in for a final interview. Mrs. Harper, I've completed my evaluation. Ruth sat straight in her chair, hands folded in her lap, determined to face whatever verdict Dr. Peterson had reached with as much dignity as she could muster. I find no evidence of cognitive impairment or mental incompetence, Dr. Peterson said, and Ruth felt her knees go weak with relief. Your memory is intact, your reasoning abilities are sound, and your decision-making process appears to be based on considered judgment, rather than impaired thinking. Ruth managed to keep her voice steady. Thank you, doctor. I will be recommending to the court that the guardianship petition be denied. Your decision to help an injured stranger demonstrates compassion and sound moral judgment, not mental illness. As Ruth left the evaluation center, she felt like she was emerging from a nightmare into daylight. The fight wasn't over, members. There would still be a court hearing, still be lawyers and testimony, and the final decision of a judge who didn't know her. But she had passed the first test, proven that she was mentally competent, despite her son's accusations. Vincent was waiting for her in the parking lot, leaning against his motorcycle with obvious relief on his face. When he saw her emerge from the building, he broke into the kind of grin that transformed his entire appearance, from intimidating biker to concerned friend. How do you feel? He asked. Ruth considered the question seriously. She felt tired, angry, grateful, and determined in equal measure, but mostly she felt ready to fight for the life she'd chosen, rather than accept the one other people wanted to impose on her. Free, she said simply, and ready for whatever comes next. The courthouse smelled like old wood and broken dreams. Ruth sat beside Sarah Morrison in the plaintiff's section, her hands folded in her lap, watching Nathan avoid her eyes from across the aisle. Her son looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by the weight of his desperation and the shabby suit that couldn't quite hide how far he'd fallen. Lisa sat behind Nathan, dressed in black like she was attending a funeral, which in a way, she was the funeral of her plan to solve their financial problems by seizing control of Ruth's assets. Sarah Morrison was everything Thomas had promised, sharp-eyed, confident, and completely focused on the battle ahead. She'd spent the past week preparing Ruth for this moment, explaining the process, coaching her on testimony, and assembling evidence that would expose Nathan and Lisa's true motivations. All rise for the Honorable Judge Williams. Judge Williams was younger than Ruth had expected, maybe 55, with graying hair and the patient expression of someone who'd seen every variety of family dysfunction the legal system could produce.
He reviewed the case files while the courtroom waited in tense silence, occasionally glancing up to study the faces of the people whose lives he was about to judge. "This is a petition for emergency guardianship filed by Nathan Bennett concerning his mother Ruth Harper, age 73, Judge Williams began, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years on the bench. "Mr. Bennett, your attorney may proceed." Nathan's lawyer, a thin man named Hendricks who looked like he specialized in personal injury cases and divorce settlements, stood with theatrical gravity. "Your Honor, Nathan Bennett seeks guardianship of his mother because she has demonstrated serious lapses in judgment that put herself and her community at risk. She has been associating with members of a known criminal organization, the Hells Angels motorcycle gang, and has shown clear signs of cognitive decline that make her vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation." Ruth listened to her own son's attorney paint her as a helpless, confused old woman who couldn't be trusted to make her own decisions. Every act of kindness was twisted into evidence of incompetence, every moment of human connection transformed into proof of mental decline. Hendricks called Mrs. Caldwell as his first witness. Ruth's former neighbor took the stand with obvious relish, clearly excited to be the center of attention in such dramatic proceedings. "I've known Ruth Harper for 15 years, Mrs. Caldwell testified, her voice quivering with manufactured concern. "She's always been a quiet, respectable woman, but in recent weeks, she's been acting very strangely, letting dangerous criminals into her home, ignoring the concerns of her neighbors, making decisions that put the entire community at risk." "Can you describe the individuals Mrs. Harper has been associating with?" Hendricks asked.
"Motorcycle gang members," Mrs. Caldwell replied, as if the words tasted bitter in her mouth. "Hells Angels. Everyone knows they're involved in drugs and violence. They've been coming to her house regularly, sometimes late at night. The whole neighborhood has been concerned." Sarah Morrison's cross-examination was swift and surgical. "Mrs. Caldwell, have you ever personally witnessed any criminal activity at Mrs. Harper's residence?" "Well, no, but have you ever seen any evidence of drug use, violence, or theft?" "Not directly, but have you ever actually spoken to any of these motorcycle club members?" Mrs. Caldwell's face reddened. "I wouldn't lower myself to. So your testimony is based entirely on assumptions and prejudice rather than observed facts." "Objection." Hendricks stood quickly. "Sustained," Judge Williams said, but Ruth noticed he was taking notes. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from other neighbors, all painting Ruth as a confused elderly woman who'd been taken in by dangerous criminals. But Sarah's cross-examinations revealed that none of them had witnessed any actual wrongdoing, that their concerns were based on stereotype and assumption rather than evidence. When it was the defense's turn, Sarah stood with quiet confidence. "Your Honor, this petition isn't about Mrs. Harper's competence. It's about her son's desperation. Nathan Bennett and his wife Lisa are facing significant financial difficulties, and they see Mrs. Harper's assets as a solution to their problems." Sarah's first witness was Jake Morrison, who took the stand with professional composure despite his leather jacket and visible tattoos. The contrast between his appearance and his articulate testimony was clearly designed to challenge the court's preconceptions. "I'm a licensed private investigator," Jake testified. "I've been researching the Bennett family's financial situation. Nathan Bennett has accumulated gambling debts totaling $53,000. He's been arrested twice for public intoxication, and once for disturbing the peace. His wife Lisa was fired from her job for suspected embezzlement, and is currently under investigation by the district attorney's office." Sarah presented bank records, employment documents, witness statements from Murphy's Tavern about Lisa's bragging about selling Ruth's house. The evidence painted a devastating picture of two people who'd reached the end of their financial rope and saw guardianship as their last chance to access money that didn't belong to them. Furthermore, Jake continued, Lisa Bennett was recorded on 3 separate occasions telling patrons at Murphy's Tavern that once they gained control of Ruth Harper's assets, they planned to sell her house and move to Florida. She described the guardianship petition as the easiest money we'll ever make. Nathan's face went white as Jake's testimony demolished any pretense that this case was about concern for Ruth's welfare. But Sarah's most powerful witness was Dr. Peterson herself. The psychiatrist took the stand with professional composure, her clinical assessment carrying the weight of medical authority. I found no evidence of cognitive impairment or mental incompetence in Mrs. Harper, Dr. Peterson testified. Her memory is intact, her reasoning abilities are sound, and her decision-making process appears to be based on careful consideration rather than impaired judgment. Her choice to help an injured stranger during a storm demonstrates compassion and moral clarity, not mental illness. Dr. Peterson's testimony was followed by character witnesses, Officer Martinez, who spoke about Ruth's cooperation during the police visits, the librarian who described Ruth's decades of community service, Vincent's employer at Morrison's garage, who testified about the motorcycle club's charitable work and Vincent's reputation as an honest, hard-working man. Finally, Sarah called Ruth herself to testify. Ruth gripped the rail as she lowered herself into the witness chair, her knees protesting the movement. For a moment she had to steady her breathing, but when she raised her head to speak, her voice carried with surprising strength. She spoke clearly about the night of the storm, her decision to help Vincent, the relationship she'd built with the motorcycle club members. Mrs. Harper, Sarah asked, "Do you understand why your son is concerned about your association with the Hells Angels?" "I understand that people often fear what they don't understand," Ruth replied, "but I've seen these men's actions, not just their appearance. They've shown me nothing but respect and kindness. They've contributed thousands of dollars to local charities and volunteer their time for community service projects. Do you feel mentally competent to manage your own affairs?" Ruth looked directly at Nathan, meeting his eyes for the first time since the hearing began. "I feel more mentally competent now than I have in years. For the first time since my husband died, I'm making choices based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. That's not mental incompetence, that's mental health." Hendrick's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. Ruth answered each question calmly and thoughtfully, demonstrating exactly the kind of mental clarity that contradicted his client's claims. "Mrs. Harper, don't you think it's unusual for a woman your age to befriend motorcycle gang members?" A mother rose from the benches, voice trembling. "When my son needed surgery, these men raised the money in a week. I don't care what jackets they wear, they saved his life. Aren't you concerned about your safety?" "I'm more concerned about my safety with people who would use legal documents to steal my independence than I am with friends who've never shown me anything but respect." After both sides had rested their cases, Judge Williams called a recess to review the evidence. Ruth sat with Sarah in the courthouse cafeteria, drinking terrible coffee and trying not to think about what would happen if they lost. "How do you think we did?" Ruth asked. Sarah smiled grimly. "We presented the facts. Nathan and Lisa's financial desperation, their history of poor judgment, their complete lack of evidence for your supposed incompetence. The contrast between their accusations and your actual performance on the stand should be pretty clear to anyone paying attention." When court reconvened, Judge Williams looked tired but certain. He'd clearly spent the recess reviewing testimony and evidence, weighing the competing claims about Ruth's mental state and best interests. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented in this case," Judge Williams began, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "This court finds that Mrs. Ruth Harper is mentally competent and fully capable of managing her own affairs. The petition for guardianship is denied." Ruth felt tears of relief slip down her cheeks. Her legs trembled, and she reached for Sarah Morrison's steady arm to keep from sinking under the flood of emotions. Judge Williams wasn't finished. "Furthermore, the evidence suggests that this petition was motivated by financial desperation rather than genuine concern for Mrs. Harper's welfare. The court finds that Nathan Bennett and Lisa Bennett have engaged in elder abuse through legal manipulation and attempted financial exploitation." Nathan's face went from white to green as the implications of the judge's words sank in. "I am therefore issuing a restraining order prohibiting Nathan Bennett and Lisa Bennett from contacting Mrs. Harper or coming within 200 yards of her property for a period of 2 years. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and prosecution." As the gavel fell, Ruth felt something break loose in her chest. Years of guilt about Nathan's failures, decades of wondering if she'd been a good enough mother, months of fear that she might lose everything Samuel had worked for to her son's greed and desperation. Nathan and Lisa left the courtroom without a word, their heads down and their futures uncertain. They'd gambled everything on a legal strategy that had backfired spectacularly, exposing their true motives and destroying any remaining relationship with Ruth. Outside the courthouse, Vincent was waiting beside his motorcycle, his face breaking into a grin when he saw Ruth emerge from the building with Sarah. Thomas, Jake and Eddie were there too, along with several other club members who'd taken time off work to support Ruth through her legal battle. "How does it feel to be a free woman?" Vincent asked. Ruth considered the question seriously. She felt relieved, vindicated, and profoundly sad all at the same time. She'd won her independence, but she'd lost her son in the process. "It feels like justice," she said finally. "Painful justice, but justice nonetheless." Sarah shook Ruth's hand with professional satisfaction. "You did great up there. Your testimony was clear, compelling and completely demolished their case." Ruth nodded, but privately she was thinking about Nathan, not the desperate, greedy man who'd tried to steal her life, but the little boy who'd once helped her plant roses and dreamed of saving the world. Somewhere along the way, that little boy had gotten lost, and Ruth grieved for him even as she celebrated her victory over the man he'd become. "What happens now?" Ruth asked. Vincent smiled and gestured toward his motorcycle. "Now you come home. Your real home, with your real family." As Ruth climbed onto the back of Vincent's bike for the ride back to Maple Street, she felt the wind in her hair, and the sun on her face, and realized that freedom felt exactly like she'd always imagined it would, exhilarating and terrifying, and absolutely worth fighting for. Behind them, the courthouse grew smaller in the distance, but Ruth didn't look back. She was done with courtrooms and legal battles and family members who measured her worth in dollars rather than dignity. Ahead of her lay the life she'd chosen, complicated and unconventional, and filled with people who valued her for who she was, rather than what she could provide. Ruth Harper had fought for her right to choose her own path, and she'd won. 6 months after the court victory, Ruth's kitchen had been transformed into something she'd never expected, the unofficial headquarters for Wyoming's most unlikely charitable organization. Every Saturday morning, her dining room table hosted the Hells Angels weekly planning meetings, where 8 to 10 leather-clad bikers gathered to organize fundraisers, coordinate community service projects, and plan events that had quietly revolutionized the small town's approach to helping those in need. Ruth kept the coffee pot full, and baked cookies when her hands weren't too stiff, though Vincent often carried the heavier trays for her. She laughed off his fussing, but secretly she was grateful for the help. The Angels supplied the energy, organizational skills and resources that turned good intentions into effective action. Together they'd created something neither could have accomplished alone, a bridge between worlds that had previously viewed each other with suspicion and fear. "The Children's Hospital in Denver wants us back for another fundraising ride," Thomas reported, consulting his notes while reaching for his third cookie of the morning. "They've raised their goal to $85,000 this time, based on what we brought in last year." Vincent nodded from his usual spot beside Ruth's chair, his presence as natural and comfortable as if he'd been part of her family for decades rather than months. "I can get Morrison's Garage to sponsor again. Maybe bring in some of the other local businesses that have been asking about getting involved." Ruth listened to their planning with the kind of deep satisfaction she hadn't felt since her library days. This was purpose with meaning, community with impact, the sense of belonging to something larger than herself that she'd been missing without realizing it for years. The Saturday meetings had become so routine that even the local police had adapted to accommodate them. Officer Martinez timed his patrol route to coincide with fresh cookies and coffee, turning what had once been suspicious surveillance into genuine community policing. "Morning, Mrs. Harper," Martinez said as he knocked on the back door. "Right on schedule. How's the planning committee today?" "Loud and productive," Ruth replied, pouring him a cup of coffee from the pot she'd started keeping warm specifically for his weekly visits. "They're working on a scholarship fund for kids whose parents can't afford college tuition." Martinez settled into the chair that had become unofficially his, completely comfortable among men he'd once viewed with automatic suspicion. 6 months of watching the Angels' community involvement had transformed his perspective as dramatically as it had the rest of the town's. "Any word from Nathan?" he asked quietly, a question that had become part of their routine. Ruth shook her head. Nathan and Lisa had left Wyoming immediately after the court hearing, reportedly moving to Florida where Lisa's sister lived. They'd left no forwarding address, and made no attempt at reconciliation. The restraining order had another year and a half to run,
but Ruth doubted Nathan would ever try to contact her again. "I heard Mrs. Caldwell sold her house," Martinez mentioned casually. Ruth nodded, she'd heard the same. Mrs. Caldwell had finally given up her campaign against Ruth's criminal associates when it became clear that the rest of the neighborhood had moved from suspicion to grudging respect to genuine appreciation for the Angels' contributions to local causes. At the Christmas toy drive, Eddie lifted a shy little boy onto his shoulders so he could hang a star on the tree. A reporter snapped a photo, and by evening it was on the front page. The Angels had organized 3 major charity drives, contributed over $20,000 to local causes, and volunteered hundreds of hours for community service projects. Meanwhile, Nathan and Lisa, the respectable family members who'd claimed to be concerned about Ruth's welfare, had been exposed as manipulative opportunists willing to destroy an elderly woman's life for money. That afternoon, while Vincent repaired a loose board on Ruth's back steps and Jake worked on tuning up her ancient lawnmower, Ruth tended to her garden and reflected on how completely her life had been transformed. The roses Samuel had planted 30 years ago were thriving under Vincent's careful attention, and the vegetable garden that had been neglected since Samuel's death was now producing enough tomatoes and peppers to supply half the neighborhood. Vincent's voice was thoughtful as he tested the repaired step. "I've been thinking about something Thomas mentioned last week." "What's that?" Vincent set down his hammer and looked at her with the kind of serious expression that usually preceded important conversations. "He wants to make you an honorary member of the club, full voting rights in our charitable foundation, official recognition of your contributions, the whole thing." Ruth looked up from her tomatoes, genuinely surprised. "An honorary Hell's Angel? It's not as crazy as it sounds," Vincent said quickly. "You've been integral to everything we've accomplished this year. The scholarship fund was your idea. The toy drive for foster kids was your idea. Half our most successful projects came from your suggestions." Ruth considered this unexpected development. 6 months ago, the idea of being officially associated with a motorcycle club would have been now it felt like a natural recognition of bonds that had grown stronger and more meaningful than many traditional family relationships. What would that involve? Mostly what you're already doing. Being family, being someone we can count on. Being proof that real family isn't about blood or background, it's about choosing to care for each other. That evening, as Vincent prepared to leave for his own apartment across town, he paused at Ruth's back door with the kind of hesitation that suggested important words were coming. "Ruth, I want you to know something. When I lost my family in that fire, I thought I'd never have a real home again. The Angels gave me brotherhood, but you gave me something different, something I didn't even realize I was missing." Ruth waited, understanding that whatever Vincent was trying to say was difficult for him to articulate. "You gave me a mother again. Someone who cares whether I eat proper meals and get enough sleep and remember to take my vitamins. Someone who worries when I'm late and celebrates when good things happen and listens when I need to talk through problems." Ruth felt tears sting her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from joy rather than sorrow. "And you gave me a son. Someone who fixes my steps and changes my oil, and remembers that I like extra sugar in my coffee. Someone who includes me in his world, and makes me feel useful and necessary." They hugged goodbye, a ritual that had developed naturally over months of shared experiences and mutual affection. Ruth watched Vincent drive away before locking her doors and settling into her evening routine, but tonight the house didn't feel empty the way it had for 7 years after Samuel's death. Tonight it felt full of possibility, of connection, of the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more opportunities to be useful, to contribute, to matter in the lives of people who valued her for who she was, rather than what she could provide. 3 weeks later, Ruth found herself standing in the backyard of Thomas Morrison's ranch house, surrounded by nearly 50 Hells Angels from chapters across Wyoming and Colorado, participating in a ceremony that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. Thomas stood at the center of the gathering, holding a leather jacket that looked remarkably similar to the one he'd given Ruth months earlier, but with one significant addition: an embroidered patch that read "Honorary Member" surrounded by the club's colors and symbols. "Ruth Harper," Thomas announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the gravity of someone making a historic pronouncement. "You opened your door to one of our brothers when everyone else in your neighborhood chose to look the other way. You welcomed us into your home when we were strangers. You stood up to legal challenges and community pressure rather than abandon the friendships you'd chosen to build. Ruth looked around at the faces surrounding her, men and women she'd come to know over months of Saturday meetings and charity events, people who'd become more of a family to her than her actual blood relatives had ever been. Vincent stood directly beside her, his pride evident in every line of his face. More than that, Thomas continued, you've shown us that real strength comes from compassion, that true courage means opening your heart to people others are afraid to understand. You've made us better people by believing we could be better than our reputation. Thomas held up the jacket, and Ruth slipped her arms into sleeves that felt like they'd been tailored specifically for her. The leather was soft and well made, but more importantly, it represented acceptance into a community that measured worth by character rather than social status. Ruth Harper, Thomas concluded, by the authority vested in me as president of the Wyoming Hells Angels, I hereby name you an honorary member of this brotherhood. You are our sister, our family, and our proof that angels really do walk among us. The applause was thunderous, accompanied by the revving of motorcycle engines and the kind of joyful celebration that marked truly significant moments. Ruth felt overwhelmed by the warmth and acceptance surrounding her, by the realization that she'd found her place in a community she never could have imagined belonging to. Jake Morrison appeared beside her with a manila folder. There's one more thing, he said with a grin. Since you're officially family now, we thought you should see this. Ruth opened the folder to find newspaper clippings from across the region. Unlikely partnership raises $100,000 for Children's Hospital. Motorcycle club and elderly volunteer transform small-town charity work. How one widow's kindness changed everything. The stories all featured photographs of Ruth working alongside the angels at various charity events, her white hair and gentle smile contrasting dramatically with the leather and tattoos surrounding her. But in every photo, the mutual respect and genuine affection between Ruth and her chosen family was evident. You're famous, Vincent said, reading over her shoulder. The story of the librarian who became an honorary Hells Angel has made newspapers in 6 states. Ruth laughed, genuinely delighted by the absurdity of her unexpected celebrity. I can't imagine what Mrs. Caldwell would think if she saw these. Mrs. Caldwell's loss, Thomas said firmly. She chose fear over understanding. You chose courage over comfort. That's why you're family, and she's just another person who moved to Florida to complain about the heat. As the celebration continued around her, Ruth found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 1 year ago she'd been a lonely widow whose greatest excitement came from library board meetings and grocery shopping. Tonight she was surrounded by people who'd become closer than blood family, wearing colors that represented acceptance into a brotherhood that valued character over conformity. The transformation hadn't been easy. She'd faced community judgment, family betrayal, legal battles, and the constant challenge of redefining herself outside the narrow categories society had created for women her age. But every difficult moment had been worth it for this more's the knowledge that her life had meaning beyond mere maintenance, that her choices mattered to people who valued courage over respectability. 1 year after Ruth's honorary patch, the Wyoming Hells Angels were local legend, leather and kindness in the same sentence. In a converted warehouse Ruth had insisted become a community center. She stirred a stockpot big enough to warm 200 bellies while volunteers ferried bread in crates. Maria Santos, a single mother who'd arrived timid and now ran the sign-in table like a captain, called, "We're low on rolls." In the back freezer, Ruth said, "Vincent stocked it yesterday." The monthly meal had grown teeth and wings, food service braided with a coat swap, job leads and someone to sit and listen. Vincent moved through the noise like muscle with a gentle touch, hauling water, fixing a bulky door, giving Ruth space to do what she did best, see people. At noon a small local news team came in with a deputy from City Hall. The camera swept the room, kids laughing, angels loading boxes, Ruth at her pot, and the deputy shook Ruth's hand. "On behalf of the city, thank you. We're featuring the center this week." A quick interview, a photo with volunteers, then they were gone, proof that reputations can turn when the work doesn't stop. By afternoon, Thomas dropped into a folding chair. 47 applications for 12 scholarships, he said. "Make it 15, Ruth answered. "We raised enough, let's act like it." Months lengthened, Work continued. The scholarship committee met, 15 names circled in ink. The center's Saturday planning sessions became their heartbeat. Ruth learned to accept attention without letting it swallow the quiet. When anyone asked what made their program different, she said, "We don't just feed people, we remember their names next week." One morning, the phone rang with a Florida number she'd ignored for a year. On the 7th ring, Ruth answered. "Mom," Nathan sounded older, smaller. "I wasn't sure you'd pick up." "I wasn't sure either," he apologized, not to bargain, but to admit. Sober 8 months, working construction, debts paid down, divorce final. "I know I can't ask for anything. I see the articles, you look happy. I'm trying to be someone you'd be proud of, even if it's too late for us." Ruth remembered a boy in a backyard planting roses carefully around fragile roots. "It may be too late for what we had," she said, gentler than she felt, "but not too late for who you could be." When the line went quiet, it felt like a door had closed without slamming. Later Vincent slid into the kitchen chair beside her. "You okay?" He called to apologize. She said, "I'm relieved, sad, mostly grateful I learned the difference between the family you're born with and the family you choose." He squeezed her hand. "Speaking of chosen family, Maria's organizing a camping weekend for the scholarship kids. Thomas wants to know if you're in. I wouldn't miss it." The center kept humming. The same local segment that had filmed months before returned to cover the scholarship ceremony. The deputy from City Hall handed Ruth a framed commendation while the anchor signed off with, "Sometimes a town changes because one person opened a door." On quieter afternoons, Ruth read the paper with the window open, listening to the clatter and laughter of people loading boxes. She thought of that first storm, the knock, the fear, the choice, and how the ripple had traveled. A meal, a scholarship, a secret told in love, a son who might yet become kinder than his history. When the phone rang again, it was Thomas with a plan to help another chapter clone their model. "1 weekend a month," he said. "Teach what you've built." "We go," Ruth replied, "but we insist on one rule, no program without relationships. Food is fuel, names are roots." She set the receiver down and watched Vincent and Maria dry the dishes, bickering lightly over where the good knives belonged. Family, she thought, and smiled at the word's new shape. Family, she thought, and smiled at the word's new shape. Some storms take, some deliver. Ruth had learned to open her door to both.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.